kind of what the, you can kind of see what the burrows look like. There's a PVC pipe with an irrigation box at the end as a nest box, and that's how we dig them in. We had a burrow building workshop up at Chris Rice. Chris Rice is the tall British gentleman there up on the upper right-hand corner. He was a big volunteer with their Project Perch down in Broward, and he has showed us the way to go. And we also, what? Anyway, we also have paired with one of the schools out there and put burrows in at Dawson Elementary that's off of Big Bend Road. And this was kind of the program that we were using with them, plant a burrow and grow an owl. So far, no burrows there. And maybe this fall we'll have t-shirts, I don't know. But anyway, that's our program. You can find out more about it from Tampa Audubon, and Shirley, hope that you'll want to participate. And if you do, you can email me. And we're pairing with ELAP to put the burrows on some of the ELAP properties. So thank you.
The picture is coming from my iPad. The sound is coming from.
Someone needs to mute themselves. Okay. Anne, who's up next?
Tina, please talk to us about the Native Plant Society.
You're muted, Tina.
I am unmuted now. Thank you. Hi, I'm Tina Patterson from the Suncoast Chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. I'm secretary and standing in for our president, who's traveling in Alaska this month. So she's having a good time, I hope, in cooler weather. I actually am a member of all three of the organizations meeting tonight. And what I found is that they all three are serving a common purpose, but offering unique opportunities to learn and volunteer. At the Suncoast Native Plant Society, of course, we emphasize and promote education about native plants, how they help wildlife, how they help us, how they help our environment. So we do field trips, we have work days and volunteer opportunities, and we do some advocacy for using more native plants in landscaping, both public and private. We provide information to people that are interested in making their yards more wildlife friendly. Also in, as I said, providing more native plants for public landscapes by maintaining native plant gardens in some of our local parks. I had two announcements for our members that wanted to remind them that this Sunday is our field trip. July 18th, we're going to Little Red Wagon Native Nursery. So we're going to do something a little cooler. We have been recently to USF Forest Preserve with Lacoochee State Forest, Upper Tampa Bay Park. But we decided to go a little more casual now. Also, we're doing our second monthly work day at Lettuce Lake in the Native Plant Garden on July 27th. That's a Tuesday at 8 a.m. So you can go to our website. I'll put it in the chat. If anyone's interested in participating in any of those events, you can contact me or go to the website and find the contacts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tina. If anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And Rocky, you're up, so share your screen and take yourself off mute. Pretty please. Take yourself off mute.
I am off mute, but my share button is gone. Oh, here we go. It came back. Let me get it up here. Okay. I I'm Rocky Milburn of the Tampa Bay Sierra Club. I represent the Tampa Bay Sierra Club. We are in the Tampa Bay area, and I'm just going to stroll through some slides as I talk. This
You've gone. We can't hear you. Well, I don't know where he went.
the Tampa Bay region. The Florida chapter is the second largest now.
Rocky, your voice is fading in and out. We can't hear you.
Can you guys see? Something happened in my screen.
Well, we couldn't hear you for a while there.
Okay.
No, you're gone again. Your screen's not moving.
Rocky, if you would email your PowerPoint to Mary, she might be able to.
Someone's
share it.
using,
Because I think what's happening is your communication, your Wi-Fi or whatever is just not powerful enough to run both the PowerPoint and you talking. So it may be a little unstable. So if you would just go ahead and email your slideshow to Mary, and then she can pull it up. I think we can get around this glitch.
no, it's
Rocky, can you just tell us what you were intending without the slides? Actually, I think we've lost him completely.
I don't see Rocky at all. I think electricity, maybe there's a storm over by where he is. So what I think, if he comes back on and if he sends the slideshow to you, Mary, maybe you can do it and we'll just have the Sierra Club portion at the end after Stan.
That's going to be tricky because I've got Stan's slides here on mine and I'm not going to be able to have my email open to get it from Rocky.
Okay, well, let's just move on. Is there another person with the Sierra Club who would like to say what they think Rocky wanted to say?
This is Shirley Denton. If I can get him to send me the slideshow, I will run the slideshow and he can probably communicate voice later on his cell phone.
Okay, that would be better.
Let me try to get it from him.
Yeah, if he emails it to you, can you send him an email and tell him or call him and ask him to send it to you?
Yes,
all right.
I will.
Let's do this. I will go ahead and get Stan's slides up and introduce him, and he can go ahead and do his, and then we'll have Rocky and Shirley tag team with the Sierra Club announcements at the end. How does that sound? So I will put Stan's up. All right. Okay. So our speaker this evening, Stanley Kroh, is the manager of the Land and Stewardship Programs for the Environmental Services Department at TECO, Tampa Electric. He's been there for 21 years. part of his duties, he manages the Manatee Viewing Center and the Florida Conservation and Technology Center. Before he worked for Tampa Electric, he worked for EPC for Hillsborough County in the Wetlands Management Division. Other than managing the viewing center, etc., he's also active in the local environmental community, serves as president of Keep Tampa Bay Beautiful Board of Trustees, immediate past chair of the Hillsborough Greenways Committee. And I will add that he is on the board of directors for the Florida Birding and Nature Festival. And we thank them very much for the use of the Manatee Viewing Center as our location for the festival this fall that Ann was talking about. He is also the 2019 recipient of the Keep America Beautiful Iron-Eyes Cody Award, the highest national award given to a male volunteer for his dedication to environmental cleanups and restoration around Tampa Bay. So with that, I will introduce Stan, and he's going to do the talking, and I am going to do the click forward. Whoop, well, click too soon. So Stan, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. Very happy to be here speaking with you this evening. And a huge shout out to Mary Keith for helping me with this presentation, because I was having some technical problems. My company doesn't like us to use Zoom, and so I was having a hard time with the PowerPoint, but Mary graciously stepped in and helped me get some kinks worked out, and she's going to be advancing the slides, so I don't have to worry about that. So thank you. Also, before I get started, just want to let you know I'm a pretty informal person, so if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you're welcome to interrupt me, or you can post them in chat, and Mary's going to be monitoring the chat feature just to see if any questions come up. But feel free to ask me questions as we're on a particular topic, or you can wait till the very end and we'll have a question and answer session then as well. You can go to the next slide, Mary. So just want to let everyone know, just in case you're not familiar with Tampa Electric Company, our service territory, we have 6 different service areas, and they cover all of Hillsborough County, but we extend a little bit into Pinellas County, and we're also in Pasco County as well as Polk County. And so you can see our service area there. We have 2,200 square miles of territory, almost 800,000 customers now. We have over 12,000 miles of transmission and distribution lines, over 400,000 poles, over 200 substations, and actually I just realized the slide hasn't been updated. We now have 12 utility scale solar power projects with more coming. And we also have 80,000 overhead transformers, and these are oil-filled transformers, as well as 68,000 pad mounted. So we have a lot of infrastructure throughout the territory. And as you'll hear later, all those miles and miles of wires, birds really like to perch and roost there and sometimes nest there, and that can be a problem. So that's something we deal with on a regular basis. Next.
Well, now mine has,
Oh no.
there we go.
Very good. So this is a really wide-ranging talk tonight. I'm going to be covering a lot of different areas, and I'm going to be going through it pretty quickly. But just wanted to give you just an idea of the breadth of our commitment to the environment. And this is a really big project going on right now at Big Bend Power Station. That's our oldest power plant that's in Apollo Beach. You can see the old plant up near the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And then near the lower left-hand corner of the slide, this is our modernization project. So units 1 and 2, and by the way, Big Bend Power Station is a 4-unit, originally coal-fired power plant. Unit 2 is being retired, and Unit 1 is being converted into a combined cycle natural gas-fired power plant. It's a $1 billion project, and it should have its initial firing later this year. And so we're very quickly transitioning away from coal to other forms of fuel, as well as renewables and distributed energy, which I'll talk about later. So I mentioned that we now have 12 utility scale projects that are solar, utility scale solar sites, and wanted to just give you a kind of an idea of some of the challenges we face from an environmental standpoint when we're permitting those sites. And by the way, these are very large sites. Our typical solar site is 300 to 500 acres. Each one of them is 300 to 500 acres. So when I say we already have 12 that are producing power, you can just quickly do the math and see how many acres of land we're talking about. You can go to the next slide, Mary. So right now we have over 620 megawatts online. And again, that actual number is 12 now, utility scale solar projects. There's 6 in Hillsborough County. There's been about the same number in Polk County, and we're now developing a site in Pasco County as well. But the current count is almost 5,000 acres of land. And that also required over 13 miles of new transmission lines. And these are just a couple of shots from our, a couple of our solar sites, give you an idea of just how massive these sites are. And in most cases, as you can really see this in the top paragraph, not paragraph, the top slide, this is a former orange grove that is being converted into a solar site. You can go to the next one, Mary.
I'm trying to admit people. I can't do both. For
Sorry.
some reason, my computer, come on. There we go.
Very good, thank you. One of our biggest challenges is wetlands. As you know, there are many wetlands scattered throughout the Tampa Bay region. And those are both herbaceous, as you see in this slide. And then on the next one is an example of a forested wetland. And very early on, Tampa Electric Company made a commitment not to impact wetlands if at all possible. And go to the next slide, Mary. And here's an example of one of our sites. This is our Bonnie Mine solar site. That's one of the earlier solar sites that we developed. It's out in Pasco County. And the blue areas, those are wetlands. And you can see the way they're scattered throughout the site. It makes it more difficult to develop a site and not impact wetlands. But we were able to do that, as you can see in the next slide. So this is the same site, and you can see the way we configured the solar panels and arrays around those wetlands. The gray shaded areas, those are where all the PV panels are, the photovoltaic panels. And then the white areas, those are wetlands that were not disturbed. So again, we've developed almost 5,000 acres for these solar sites. And so far, we've only had to impact a little over 4 acres of wetlands. And those aren't all necessarily wetlands as you think of them. Sometimes they're just other surface waters, and as defined by the state. So that might have just been a ditch or an old cattle pond or something like that. But again, only a little over 4 acres, and that's out of almost 5,000 acres of development. So the total there, we've only about 0.1% of acres of wetlands and other surface waters were impacted. It's a remarkable accomplishment. And then, of course, we also have to deal with wildlife issues as well. Gopher tortoises are certainly a big one because a lot of these are high dry areas if they don't have wetlands, and that's a popular spot for gopher tortoises. Gopher tortoises are considered threatened at the state level, and so they are very much protected. You can go to the next slide, Mary. And this was one of our sites. This was out in the Lithia area. And all those little dots, you can see those were gopher tortoises that were identified before this site was developed. And so when you have gopher tortoises on a site like this, you can either avoid the burrow, which is impossible when they're spread out over to the extent that they were on this site. I believe they originally identified over 500 burrows, and of those, a little over 200 were actually active burrows. And so what we do in a case like that is we have to get permits, and then we have to have someone come in and trap the tortoises, and then they are relocated to a tortoise mitigation bank. Very, very expensive project. It costs thousands of dollars per tortoise to go through this process. Next, please. Another wildlife species we deal with is the eastern indigo snake. And this is a threatened species at the federal level. I'm sure most of the folks on this call are very familiar with that snake. Absolutely gorgeous animal. They do live in gopher tortoise burrows along with lots of other species that make use of those burrows. So before we develop a site, we have to do a survey to see if there are any indigo snakes on site. And if there are, then we have to avoid their habitat. And more importantly, we have to provide training to all the contractors working on site so they know to watch for these snakes and how to avoid them and not cause them any harm. Next, Mary. We also deal with lots of Kestrel issues. We have a site that's under development at the Hillsborough-Pasco County line, our Magnolia solar site, and an adjacent Laurel Oaks solar site had about 15 different Kestrel nests on site. And so again, we have to avoid impacting their nesting and foraging areas, or we can get a permit to take them, but we prefer not to do that. So we avoid their habitat whenever possible. At the Magnolia and Laurel Oak sites, we're actually doing a research project in conjunction with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to see how well kestrels utilize habitat that's been used for utility scale solar like this. Because there's, in between the panels, there's still lots of grass, and we think it's probably going to be decent habitat for kestrels, but we have a study underway to demonstrate that to the Wildlife Agency. And this is that, this is the Del Monte site, which was actually split into two different solar projects, Magnolia and Laurel Oaks. And the areas in the red circles, those are where known kestrel nests are. And then the pink circles show the extent of their foraging habitat. So that is all had to be protected and respected in some way. As you can see, when you take all those circles together, that's quite a bit of habitat, as well as you can see the creek system going through there as well. That's English Creek and the upper branch of the Alafia River. All that has to be protected as well as significant wildlife habitat. So there's a lot of constraints on developing these sites. Next, Mary. We also deal with bald eagle issues, and of course, bald eagles are, they're protected by the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, as well as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And similar to the kestrels, when there's no nest on site, we have to protect the nest as well as a buffer around those nests as well. So if you go to the next slide, Mary, that demonstrates that. So this is another site that was is under development, and you can see the areas in the middle of the two concentric circles. There is a eagle nest, and so there's a primary buffer area around that, and then the larger circle is the secondary buffer area, and then to the top, the areas, the shaded gray area is where solar panels are going to go. And so we had to avoid the buffer areas as well with the development of this site. We also have to have a biologist on site to monitor the nest as well, if there's any construction going on during nesting season. And then these are two more species that we deal with. These, the sand skink and the blue-tailed mole skink, are both reptiles that burrow in the sand. So they like those sandstone scrub type habitats. We have a lot of that in in Polk County near the Lake Rails Ridge. and those are very protected species as well. Both the sand skink and the blue-tailed mole skink are federally threatened species and very much protected. In the photo on the right, of course, those are tire tracks down the center, but if you look to the left and right, and even within the tire tracks, you might see some squiggly lines, and that's where skinks have been burrowing, and that's the main way that they identify when there's skinks on site, because they mostly stay underground. They burrow through the sand. So if you go to the next slide, Mary. So this is another site that's under development in Pasco County. This is the Wheeler site. And over on all the area that's bounded in yellow, all the way to the right and down at the bottom, that section there, you see those little red circles there? That was where sand skinks were identified, and a few throughout the site other than that, but most of them were concentrated down in this corner. And so we have made the decision not to develop that whole parcel of land. As you can see from this, that's a pretty good sized chunk of land, but that will not be developed, and those skinks will be protected there, and we will have to do monitoring as well. And by the way, when we're identifying the presence of skinks on site, we're not just looking for those burrows in the sand that you saw in the previous photograph. They actually have to do board surveys where they go out and put these little, I believe they're 2 feet by 2 feet plywood boards out, and then go back later to look for the presence of skinks that have burrowed under those boards through the sand again. And on this site, we had to put 60,000 of those boards out. And then of course, those all have to be picked up later. So it's quite a process to identify the presence of these skinks. Is that a question or just extraneous noise?
No, it's somebody talking in the background. I'm trying to find who needs to be muted, and I just haven't gotten to them yet.
Just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing a question.
No.
You can go to the next slide, please. And we also deal with sandhill cranes at our sites. And we can see some examples here of nests. We're developing a site up in Pasco County, which is Pasco County, called our Mountain View Solar Site. It's right across the street from Pasco Hernando Community College. And it took a long time to get permits for that. And when we finally got all our permits in place, a pair of sandhill cranes moved onto the site right in the center of the property and made a nest. And so we had to delay construction and monitor the nest and wait until the chicks hatched and fledged before we were able to start construction. And that's another species that's threatened at the state level. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Mary. Another issue we deal with from an environmental standpoint is a lot of these sites, because they have been used as agricultural sites, they have a lot of site contamination, and sometimes the farmers have been pretty sloppy with the way they've handled chemicals and other things. So we have to go in and do cleanups. The one site I mentioned earlier that had all the kestrel nests on it, the Magnolia and the Laurel Oak sites, that had a lot of waste. That was formerly the site of a Dole Company canning facility, and they left a lot of solid waste on site. It cost $400,000 just to go in and clean up all the waste that was left on site and get rid of any contamination. And then we had to spend another $400,000 on tree surveys. So that was some really significant costs up front before we could even start thinking about developing the site. Next slide. Just another slide showing just the kind of contamination that can be left behind. A lot of pesticide jugs there. And then of course, a lot of times the labels are no longer on the jug, so we have to do testing to see what was actually in those jugs. They have to be disposed of properly. And then of course, we have to also test the soil underneath to make sure that wasn't any leakage from those jugs that might have contaminated the soil. So really big cleanups on some of these sites. And then this is not so much an environmental issue, but another thing we deal with is just cultural resources. A lot of these sites, because they do have wetlands or creek or river systems flowing through them, those are very likely sites where Native Americans had camps and you know, and thousands of years ago in some cases. The site on the left there is our English Creek site. And you can see all those red dots are where they found evidence of Native American activity, either spear points, arrowheads, or things like that. And so we have to go in and identify all those spots and then report that to the state, and then have to get permission to identify them. Fortunately, a lot of times, because they did like, the Native Americans did like to work near wetlands, a lot of times those areas are either in wetlands or in the setback area from the wetlands, so they're gonna be protected anyways. But just another thing that we have to deal with. And ironically, it's not always just Native American activity. We're getting ready to develop another site in Pasco County, near Zephyr Hills, and it has the oldest working dairy in the state of Florida. And because of that, that's considered a culturally significant resource. And so we have to document all the buildings and equipment on site, and then the state will decide which of that has to be protected. And at the very least, we'll have to memorialize the site with some kind of plaques or signage to let people know the historical significance of the site. Next, Mary. So this is one of our solar sites. As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of vegetation that grows in between these rows of solar panels, and we use sheep to control the vegetation. And the reason we use a lot, I frequently get the question, why don't we use goats? And the reason we don't use goats is because goats would jump up on top of those panels. And by the way, most of our sites have tracking panels, so the panels actually move throughout the day to track the sun. And so at midday, they're almost completely horizontal, and that would be a really attractive spot at that point for goats to jump up on. The other problem with goats is that they chew everything they can get their mouths around, and so they would eat up the wiring and everything. So sheep are a much better option for grazing. And we have a sheep rancher that comes out and lets the sheep graze there, and then he rotates. So when they've, eaten a lot of the vegetation from this site, then he will move them to one of our other solar sites. So they're constantly being rotated throughout our territory. But it works very well. Besides the utility scale solar projects, we're also in the process of building a floating solar array at Big Bend Station. We have a large pond there that receives reclaimed wastewater from the Sun City Center wastewater treatment plant. And it's really just a big storage pond where we're doing floating solar panels, as you see here. And so it has the advantage of we don't have to use up more land for solar panels, but it also helps shade the pond, and so there's less evapotranspiration from the pond as well. And I would imagine this is going to be a really popular perching spot for wading birds. But that's a newer technology that we're getting ready to deploy that should be ready in the next few months or so. Next slide, Mary. I didn't realize the slide was so blurry. I apologize for that. We're also getting ready to do an agrivoltaic project also at Big Bend Power Station. And so this is where you use the land, instead of just having grass and native plants that have to be either mowed or herbicided or grazed by animals, you can actually grow crops in between the rows of panels. You have to space the rows out a little bit farther apart, but then you do have space there for row crops. And we're getting ready to do this at Big Bend Station, and we're probably going to be growing something like squash or melon, something that stays low to the ground. But another innovative way that we're getting, another way to use solar and also get a dual use out of it as well. Next, please. We also have a battery storage project. This is also at Big Bend Station. And this is 12.6 megawatts. There's 6 of these large batteries, and these batteries are huge. They're about the size of a semi-tractor trailer, each one of them. And each one of them is about a little over 2 megawatts each. They're, as you can see here on the slide, they're lithium ion batteries. And it was about $11 million to construct that. And then we also had a $500,000 change order just for fire protection upgrades and PPC replacement. So it's about a total investment of $11.5 million. The reason that this is kind of an up and coming technology, as you know, solar is great during the daytime when you have bright sunny skies overhead. But if it's raining or at night, you're not producing any electricity. And with our business, our peak solar production is in the middle of the day around noon to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But that's not when our peak usage is for our customers. One of our biggest peak times is actually around 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. That's when everyone gets home from work, or at least that was true before the pandemic. And that's when they crank the thermostat on their AC down, they're cooking, they're doing laundry. So there's a really big uptick in electricity usage during that time. So with these batteries, we're able to store any excess energy that's created with the solar panels and then store it in these batteries. And then we're able to release that energy back to the system during our peak. So it really helps kind of level out that the peak usage period. And then hopefully, the problem with the batteries, of course, is they really only last for about 2 hours. But as the technology improves, hopefully we'll be able to have batteries that last through the night. You can go to the next slide, Mary. So this is the site under construction. Just to the right, up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a roadway there. That's US Highway 41 and Apollo Beach. So this is just west of Highway 41 and just south of Big Bend Road. And you can see the site being prepared there for this large battery project. And then to the left there, you can see our very first solar project. That's Big Bend Solar 1. And we are now developing Big Bend 2 as well as Big Bend 3. So we're going to have 3 large-scale utility solar projects right there at Big Bend Station. Next slide. And here they are bringing the batteries in. You can get a feel there for just how large each one of these batteries are. They are massive. Next slide, please. And here they are, they're being set on foundations. They have to be set on foundations because we are in a flood zone here. And so they have to be up out of the flood zone to protect the equipment as well as the safety of the workers. Next slide. And here they are after they've been set in place. You can see there's 6 of these large batteries here. In the upper photograph there, you can see the batteries. And then the lower photo there, you can see how they sit there in relation to the Big Bend 1 solar project. And again, that's Highway 41 going through there. Next, please. And just a couple more slides showing the finished battery project. And then another thing we're starting to get to in a really big way is something that's called distributed generation. On the left-hand side, you can see a diagram that kind of illustrates in a crude way the way electricity is traditionally generated and transmitted and distributed. So you have a really large power plant like our Big Bend power plant or one of the other ones. And then from there, you have transmission lines that go to areas, and then you have distribution lines that take the electricity to the final use, either homes or businesses or factories. So that's the traditional way. With distributed generation, you might still have a large central plant, but then you have other areas where electricity is generated, like wind farms or solar, or there might be small scale generators that run on natural gas. But the electricity is produced much closer to the point that it's actually used. And so this is a much more efficient way to generate and distribute electricity, because as you probably know, when you generate electricity and then have to transmit it dozens or even hundreds of miles, there is a loss in efficiency there. So by generating the electricity close to where it's actually used, you don't have that loss in efficiency. You don't lose any or don't lose as much electricity that way. And then you also don't have a need for these big, massive power plants as well. So it's something else that's a wave of the future. And we are developing one of these distributed generation sites at MacDill Air Force Base. And we're also developing another one in a new subdivision that's being developed in the South Shore area in South County. And then we also, another way we show our commitment to the environment is our development of the Florida Conservation and Technology Center. That's our partnership with the Florida Aquarium, University of Florida, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And so with our partners, we are developing all the land south of the Manatee Viewing Center, and then all the way over to US 41. So we do consider those Big Bend solar projects, as well as the battery and the floating solar and the agrivoltaics. That's all part of the Florida Conservation and Technology Center. So it's a little over 2,000 acres in total size. It's a really large project. Next slide, Mary. And so this gives you an overview, kind of in the middle of the screen, closer to the top, you see the Manatee Viewing Center. So that anchors this Florida Conservation and Technology Center to the north, and it goes all the way south to the Center for Conservation. There at the bottom, near the bottom of your screen, and then it goes all the way to the open water to the west, or to your left, and then all the way out to 41. So you can see Big Bend Solar 1 solar project, our first one, and you can see the location of where Big Bend 2, that's where Mary's pointing right now, and then Big Bend 3 is north of Big Bend Road, as well as the battery projects and the pond, the large pond that you see just to the left, right there, yes, thank you, Mary. That's the reclaimed water pond where we store water that we get from the Sun City Center wastewater treatment plant. And that's where that floating solar project is being constructed. So you can see that, again, we have the Manatee Viewing Center to the north, the Center for Conservation to the south. And I see someone just posted a question, is the Center for Conservation hosting classes or camps now? And the answer to that is yes. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission is hosting summer camps. And so if you like, afterwards, I can give you the contact information. You can talk to Kathy Gendon, the director there, and she can let you know if there's any vacancies left for summer camp. And by the way, this entire site does open to the public November 1st. So once November comes, you'll be able to visit the Manatee Viewing Center, again, which has been closed almost 18 months due to the pandemic, but then the rest of the site also opens to the public. So we're really excited about that. Next slide. So of course, it's anchored by the Manatee Viewing Center. The Manatee Viewing Center has been there for 35 years now. So when we reopen in November, we will be celebrating our 35th anniversary. And we will also be welcoming our 7 millionth visitor to the site. So it's a really popular destination, not just for Tampa Bay, but from all over the world. We literally get visitors from all over the world there. Next, please. And here's a site taken during the winter time, of course. You can see all the manatees that like to congregate there in the winter months when it's cold. We've actually had as many as 850 manatees there at one time. So it's a really big manatee sanctuary. But more importantly, it's also an important research site. FWRI does a lot of studies. There are both genetic studies and scar photography studies there. They use our site when they need to rescue ailing manatees that need to be rehabilitated. And once they're rehabilitated, many of them are released back at the Manatee Viewing Center. And this past season, we had 15 rehabilitated manatees that were released back there. The reason they like to release rehabilitated manatees here is because there is a population of manatees there in the wintertime. And so the manatees can socialize with the released manatees can socialize with the manatees that are there. But another important part of that is a lot of manatees that are rescued, they're rescued as orphan calves. And so they are raised in captivity until they're deemed ready to be released back to the wild. But because they've spent most of their lives in captivity, they don't necessarily know natural manatee behavior. They're used to being fed on a schedule and things like that, regular veterinary care. So when they're released for this population, then the idea is that they will follow manatees out of the canal when they go out to feed and learn those natural behaviors. Next, please. And just another shot showing the manatees. Really great viewing there during the winter months when it's cold. We have lots of viewing opportunities. And as Anne mentioned at the beginning of her introductory remarks, this will be the site of the Nature Expo for the Florida Birding and Nature Festival in October. And it is possible that there could be some manatees there in October. They do sometimes come in that early, especially moms with their calves. I mentioned that we do a lot of manatee captures and releases, and this is a release happening here. You can see it takes quite a few people to release one of these. They're brought in the back of a large panel truck, and they have to be lowered down, and then they put straps around them, and then you can see the blue tarp that's sitting on. So a row of people get on each side of those tarps and then carry the manatee down to the water's edge. And it can take as many as 12 people to do that. I think the largest one we released this last season weighed 850 pounds. She was a really large female. Unfortunately, she was a manatee that had been raised in captivity. When she was released, she left the canal and went into one of the canals on Apollo Beach, one of the residential canals there, and couldn't figure out how to get back out, couldn't find her way back out. And so she had to be captured again. And she was brought back to the canal at the discharge canal at the Manatee Viewing Center. And then I guess she was afraid to leave the canal after her bad experience in Apollo Beach. And so then she didn't leave the canal. So she therefore wasn't feeding and started losing too much weight. So she had to be captured another time. And so they will release her one more time, but if she can't make it on her own after the third attempt, she'll have to spend the rest of her life in captivity. So let's hope that Betty Sue figures it out. This is our new clean energy demonstration center. This is just south of the Manatee Viewing Center. And as you might have heard Ian also mention at the beginning, this is where our keynote speakers will be for the Florida Birding and Nature Festival. This is a really architecturally unique building, and it's going to display various cutting edge technologies, both renewable and distributed energy technologies. You can go to the next slide, Mary. So this is an aerial view of that. You can see the building there, and as well as some of the trails and habitat around there. We tried to leave as much of the native vegetation as we possibly could. This photograph here was taken last summer after a lot of heavy rain, so you can see all the standing water there. Also, in the center of the building, you might notice those areas that with the darker color there. Those are actually, yes, thank you, Mary. Those are ultra thin PV panels. So they're very, very thin. They have an adhesive back. So I refer to them as peel and stick PV panels, but they peel the protective backing off these and then they just stick them right to the roof. So it's a really great way, if you have the right kind of roof, it's a great way to have rooftop solar without having to drill holes into your roof. I know a lot of people have concerns about that. And in fact, at the Manatee Viewing Center, we do have more traditional rooftop PV panels there. And when those were installed, we did end up with some roof leaks. And so all the panels had to be taken back down. We had to repair the roof and then put all the panels back up there. So hopefully this kind of technology will avoid those concerns. And it's also very efficient. This is, latest technology when it comes to PV panels. So they really produce the most amount of energy for the amount of space they take up. Next slide, please. Just another shot there of the slide. You can really see the ultra thin PV panels there. Next, please. And just another shot. So you can see that this building is open air. Underneath, there's a really high roof. The whole site is on pilings because, again, we're in the coastal flood zone. But again, you can see how we left as much of the native vegetation as we could. And then we have this open air. So we're hoping that the keynote speakers for the birding festival will be there in the center of that open air. It should be a really spectacular setting for our speakers. You can also see the boardwalks there too. Yeah, thank you, Mary. This is one of the technologies that we currently have on display there. This is another one of those storage batteries that stores the power that we generate, the renewable power that we generate. This is a battery, but this is a vanadium. So unlike the ones we saw in the previous slides, but with our Big Bend battery storage project, this is a newer technology that uses vanadium. And the nice thing about vanadium is it's not as rare as some of the elements that are used in other batteries. And it's also not, it's not mined in a controversial way like some of those other rare earth metals are. They're not used, they don't use slave labor and some of the things you might have heard about other metals. And this also has a longer life. So I mentioned that the batteries at the Big Bend storage project, they're rated for 2 hours of storage. These are rated for 4 hours. And so the energy that we produce on site here with those rooftop panels, we also have a vertical axis wind turbine, which you'll see in the next couple of slides, as well as photovoltaic solar power, which you see in these slides here. Those three technologies produce more electricity than we actually use on the site. And so the excess energy is stored in that battery you saw in the previous slide. And then that energy is discharged overnight. And we actually, even with that, we're producing more energy than we need. And so that energy goes back on the grid, the excess energy. You can go to the next one, Mary. If you could go back just 1 second, one more thing. So this is a solar panel. On the right-hand side, you can see it with the PV panels stacked on top of each other. It's collapsed. And on the right-hand side, you can see it fully open. So this has, the panels are kind of shaped like flower petals, and that's why it's called a solar flower. And so it opens up in the morning, and then it tracks the sun. And then in the evening, it closes up, as you see on the right-hand side. But this also has wind monitors. So if wind speeds start getting too high, and there's any concern that it could do damage, the solar flower will go into a completely horizontal mode like you see on the left-hand side. And then if the winds increase even more than that, and there's a greater concern for damage, then they completely close up like you see on the right-hand side, and then actually go vertical. So there's very little resistance to the wind. We also have added a lot of boardwalks and nature trails throughout the campus. All that property from the Manatee Viewing Center down for the conservation has been left almost entirely in its natural state. And we have some really nice nature trails and boardwalks that go through that. Next slide, please. This is another example of one of our boardwalks. This is a bridge that actually goes over Newman Branch Creek. So when people visit the Florida Conservation Technology Center, they will park in a parking lot that's north of where this bridge is, and then they will walk over this bridge and head south to the Center for Conservation. This is a really very nice bridge, and you can see on the left-hand side, you kind of see a dividing line there. There's a narrow portion which is for pedestrians, and then the wider portion on the right-hand side is for vehicles. We're going to have eventually have some kind of system on site, either golf carts or some kind of tram system to transport visitors around the site. We don't have all that figured out yet, but that's in the works. Next, please. And then we also have a boardwalk that goes out to a wildlife observation tower. This goes out through some really nice salt tern habitat that I know Mary and Rocky and Ann were talking about earlier this evening. It also goes through some great mangrove habitat too. And looking at this slide, you might assume that we just blitzed through some mangrove habitat to create this boardwalk, but that's actually not the case. Just to the left of the boardwalk, or to the south, is Newman Branch Creek. You can't see it there for the mangroves, but that creek was dredged back decades ago to facilitate drainage of agricultural lands that were upstream. And when they dredged the creek, they just piled up the spoil where this boardwalk now is. And so the spoil piles were covered with Brazilian peppers. So we came in and eradicated the Brazilian peppers and leveled out the spoil piles and then built the boardwalk on top of that. So there were virtually no wetland impacts, even though we have a boardwalk going through some mangrove forested areas. Next slide. By the way, that boardwalk is 1/4 mile long, and then it goes to this observation tower. And the observation tower can be accessed either by the boardwalk you saw in the previous slide, or you can also canoe or kayak there via Newman Branch Creek. This is at the mouth of Newman Branch Creek, and you can see a big group of kayakers there, and they're up on top of the tower. You might be able to make that out in this photograph. Okay, next slide, Mary. We've also done a lot of habitat restoration along Newman Branch Creek. As I mentioned, Newman Branch Creek was not only was it dredged, but it was channelized and straightened. So instead of this nice meandering creek, we had almost a straight ditch, for lack of a better word, and we lost all that shoreline habitat. So we have gone in and created habitat, and believe it or not, this is a created area. This was formerly uplands. And in fact, it had 3 abandoned mobile homes on it and literally mountains of garbage, and was completely overrun with nuisance species like Brazilian pepper and Australian pine. So we came in and cleaned up all the waste and got rid of the invasive species, and then created these meandering waterways, and then did some plantings, and then of course lots of mangroves have recruited in since then. But this is a completely man-made area, and it's less than 10 years old. So it's really remarkable how fast you can get a site like this to come to maturation and provide some really great habitat. This is connected to Newman, it's hydrologically connected to Newman Branch Creek, and literally within the first week, we already had fish in these areas and lots of wading birds and mangrove seedlings already starting to take root. And again, we've done about 100 acres of acreage like this along Newman Branch Creek. Next slide. So this is the Center for Conservation. This is at the south end of the Florida Conservation Technology Center. And this is where our partners have their operations. So you see the large pond there, kind of right in the center of the screen. That is actually a saltwater pond, and it is hydrologically connected to a saltwater marsh that's just to the left of that. And then that's hydrologically connected to restoration areas that are connected to Newman Branch Creek. So the saltwater pond provides some really great fishing opportunities for all the youth groups that come out there to learn about environmental education. But it also serves as some water treatment. So both the Florida Aquarium and FWC discharge water. And so when they have used salt water that they need to discharge, they discharge it into that saltwater pond. And then from there, it flows into the saltwater marsh where it gets some biological treatment. And then from there, it flows into the Newman Branch restoration areas for additional treatment. And then eventually the creek, and then ultimately the bay. Just to the, oh, that's fine. You can keep going, Mary. So this is the first aquarium, the Florida Aquarium building that was on site. This is their Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center. And so they are rehabilitating sea turtles there, as well as doing some research on corals and sea urchins. And they, last I heard, they had 20-something turtles on site that were being rehabilitated. And these are mostly cold stunned turtles that were brought from other areas of the country. There's quite a few there from Texas. As you know, they had some really cold weather in Texas late in the season this year with a lot of turtle stranding. So some of those ended up here to be rehabilitated, and they will eventually be released back to the wild. Next slide, Mary. As I mentioned, they're also doing some very important research there on a number of species of corals. You might be aware that many of the coral reefs around Florida have been decimated by a disease that's wiped most of the populations out. And so the aquarium has been doing some research to figure out how to get these species to reproduce in captivity so they can ultimately be released back to the wild to help repopulate these reefs once that disease has run its course. And so here they are growing some fragments in their lab there. This is pillar coral, and that's a species that has been severely decimated by this disease. And these were some of the last remaining healthy fragments of pillar coral that were collected in the wild, and they're being kept here in the greenhouses at the Florida Aquarium, again, to hopefully get them to reproduce, but also then ultimately reintroduce them back to the wild so we can repopulate our reefs. Next slide. And this is just another species they're working on. This is the staghorn coral. And by the way, the aquarium has now gotten, I believe, last count, 10 different species of corals that are native to Florida to reproduce in captivity. And all of those species are a first. So it never been done before, and we now have 10 that have reproduced in captivity. It's a really remarkable success story that got some international news coverage earlier this year and late last year. Next, Mary. And then they're doing research on the longleaf, the long-spined black sea urchin. And the reason they're researching these and also getting these to reproduce in captivity is that the sea urchins are very important grazers on the reefs. They control algae that would otherwise cover the corals so they don't get as much sunlight. And back in the 80s, a different disease wiped out almost the entire sea urchin population. So the hope is that they will be able to reproduce these in large numbers and reintroduce them back to the wild so they can help ensure the health of those repopulated coral reefs. I mentioned the Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center. So this is what they call their deep dive tank. One of the issues with rehabilitating sea turtles, if you've ever been to a site where they're doing that, you have probably noticed they keep the turtles in fairly shallow pools. And the problem with that is that turtles dive for their food. And if they've been kept in a shallow pool and they have any kind of issues with diving, they don't know that until they release them back to the wild. And so when they release them, if they see they have a diving issue, then they have to recapture them and bring them back to the rehabilitation center. So this pool is about 15 feet deep. And so they're able to, once they think the turtles are ready to be released to the wild, they're able to place them in this deep dive tank. They put food down at the bottom, and they're able to observe the turtles and make sure that they're able to dive for food on their own once they're released back to the wild. This is one of just a handful of these deep dive tanks that are found around the country. Next slide. And then this is looking at that deep dive tank from the ground level. There's a window there that the researchers use to be able to observe the turtle behavior. Next. And then future plans for the aquarium. So just below that red area, that is the Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center. And then just below that in the photograph, you can see the greenhouses. That's where the coral and sea urchin research is going on. Since this photo was taken, they actually now have a third greenhouse, and they're getting ready to develop a large visitor center. Quarantine is a very big issue with these greenhouses, and so visitors won't be allowed to go in there, but they will be able to visit a visitor center and look through some big picture windows, and so they'll be able to see the work that the scientists are doing. And then to the north where that big red arrow is, that's a future plan that they hope to, if they can raise the money, they will have a facility there to do research on maybe sharks or skates or other fishes like that. They originally had plans to do research on sand tiger sharks because that's a very popular species in commercial aquariums around the world. And all those sand tiger sharks are captured in the wild. So they would like to be able to figure out how to reproduce sand tiger sharks in captivity so they could supply commercial aquariums around the world and then no longer have to harvest them from the wild. You can go to the next slide. And then this is one of our FWC buildings on site. This is the Suncoast Youth Conservation Center. This is where FWC does all their youth programming, and they've had tens of thousands of kids on site already. And the Florida Aquarium also does a lot of youth programming on site. And the nice thing about this is that they cater to a lot of homeschool and also private schools, and the aquarium also caters to Title I schools. So a lot of these are inner city students that have never had a chance to visit a site like this. They get a chance to learn how to kayak and do saltwater fishing. They're eventually going to have archery there. So there's a lot of great activities for youth there. Next slide, please. And then this is the newest building on site. This is also an FWC building, and this is called the Sport Fish Enhancement Research Facility. This is another site that will have some pretty strict quarantine requirements, but there will be a visitor center with large picture windows. And so the FWC has an ultimate goal of producing 500,000 redfish here that will be released to Tampa Bay every year. And with a year like this, where we're losing so many fish to red tide, that will be a really important endeavor to help restock the bay. Next, Mary. And that was my last slide. I know that was a lot of slides and a lot of information covered very quickly, but hopefully that gave you an overview of just how committed Tampa Electric Company is to protecting the environment. And I'm open to any questions you might have. Mary, is there anything posted in chat?
Yes, so regarding your presentation, what is TECO doing to support installation of solar panels by private citizens?
Okay, we don't necessarily have a program for private citizens because there are lots of private companies that out there that do that. We certainly don't discourage that. And with net metering, we gladly accept any excess energy that is produced from those private rooftop solar panels. We also have some larger community projects because a lot of folks either live in a neighborhood that's really shaded, or for whatever reason, they can't have rooftop panels, or they're concerned about, ending up with a leaky roof. And so we do have some larger scale community solar projects as well, so that people can invest that way. And we also have renewable energy programs. You have the option on your bill to buy $5 blocks of renewable energy, and then the money that's raised from that goes to these various renewable energy projects.
The next question is natural gas replacing coal at all the Big Bend facilities?
No, it's as I mentioned earlier, there are 4 units there, and originally those were coal-fired units. Several years ago, we upgraded all those units so they could run on coal or natural gas. So we no longer burn coal in units 1 and 2. Unit 2 is being retired, and unit 1 will run on natural gas only. And we just recently announced the retirement of unit 3. I believe that will be in 2023, which is about 20 years earlier than its original life. And I don't think a decision's been made if that will be repowered with a different fuel or not. And then that only leaves unit 4, which again can run on coal or natural gas. But my personal opinion is that we will quickly be out of the coal business altogether. And then hopefully not long after that, we'll be out of the natural gas business as well, because our hope is to have all renewable and distributed energy as the technology advances.
Okay. And I think you answered this briefly, but you might want to repeat it. Is the CFC hosting classes or camps now? And is it ever open to the general public?
Yeah, so FWC is hosting summer camps at the Center for Conservation. You would need to contact FWC. You can just go online and search for Suncoast Youth Conservation Center, and you should be able to get to that. I don't know if there are any openings left for summer camps, because summer camps are winding down because school starts in 3 weeks now? Hard to believe. The site is not currently open to the public except by appointment. However, as I mentioned earlier, this will be open to the public November 1st. So it will be open to the public 7 days a week starting in November. And you will be able to visit the Manatee Viewing Center, that Clean Energy Demonstration Center, all the trails and boardwalks and tower that we saw, as well as the Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center, the Suncoast Youth Conservation Center, and the Fish Hatchery. So there's going to be a lot to see there when we reopen.
Great. Nancy, I see you have a question. Let me share one more that came in on the chat here. What are you doing to study and manage the red tide, which is killing tons of fish?
We aren't currently doing anything. However, we are part of the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium, and we do support the Tampa Bay Estuary Program as well. So we're not doing anything directly, but we are supporting other programs that are looking into that. We also, we have very few water discharges from our plants, and the water that we do discharge is pretty clean. A lot of people think, if you've been to Big Bend Power Station, you see lots of water coming out of the discharge flumes, and a lot of folks think that we're adding chemicals or something to the water, but we don't. That's just once through cooling water. So we take water from the bay, pass it through the plant to help cool the equipment down, and that does warm the water up, but that's all that's discharged, is just warmed water. We have really strict permits that limit the amount of water we can discharge, and we are in the process of completing an underground injection control well at Big Bend Station. So a lot of waste we have will now go deep into the ground, and there won't be any chance that it gets discharged into the bay. I hope that answered your question.
Okay. Nancy, why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead with your question, and then we do have another one that came in on the chat box.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nancy Stevens. I'm with the Sierra Club, the Conservation Committee Chair. And thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting to see what you have to do to put those solar panels in. It's fascinating. But my question is related to that, and I'm glad you talked about going to 100% renewable. What can we do to help convince TECO to go faster to get to 100% renewable? The United States has set a goal of 100% renewable electricity by 2035. Can TECO do that? Can TECO, what can we do to help TECO do, convince TECO to do it to help them?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Probably the biggest challenges are the cost, because it's very, very expensive. I mentioned the amount of land that we're purchasing to do these utility scale projects. And of course, as you can imagine, property in a place like Tampa Bay is very expensive because of all the development pressure on it. So that's why we mostly go after agricultural lands. And of course, that in itself is controversial. There are folks that don't like seeing agricultural land converted to a large scale utility project like this. But we are limited to those lands only because of cost. We typically can't pay more than $15,000 to $20,000 an acre. But just at that, you can imagine if we've bought over 5,000 acres at this point at $15,000 to $20,000 an acre, there's a huge investment there just in land costs. And then of course, you've got the cost of the technology as well. All those solar panels have a cost, and you have to pay someone to install them, and then you have to pay someone to manage them once they're installed. So the cost is a big piece of it, and probably the biggest thing, this will be a controversial thing for me to say, but probably the best thing you can do is to support rate hikes, because frankly, we have to raise our rates to pay for all these distributive and renewable projects. But the upside of that is eventually when we're successful with these projects, our fuel costs go way down. We're no longer buying coal and natural gas and having to pay to have it either piped or shipped here. So, hopefully, and in the short term, rates are going to go up, but hopefully in the long term, they will come back down or at least stay flat.
Well, we'll definitely.
That's the biggest way that I think you can help is just support rate increases, but also the other issue is perhaps help us. We have, believe it or not, we've had several legal battles now with some of these solar sites because there are a surprising number of people that don't want to live near or close next to or near a large scale utility project like that. And so we've had a couple of big legal battles. I mentioned that we're developing a site up in Pasco County across from Dade Hernando Community College, or Pasco Hernando Community College. We had a massive fight there and had to go to court because adjacent landowners did not want to live next to a utility project like this. Even though the panels are they have a very low profile, they're close to the ground, they're not sticking way up in the air, because we wouldn't want to do that because of wind damage anyways. But not only do they have a low profile, but when they're adjacent to residential areas, we have to do some extensive landscape buffers. But in spite of that, we still had some pretty robust opposition to that. And again, as I mentioned, had to go to court. And ironically, this is across the street from the community college, and the site was actually zoned for townhomes. And we had folks say that they would rather have 200 to 300 townhomes there than solar panels. So there's some really interesting fights out there that we end up in. So that might be another way you could help us, is with some of that community opposition.
Sure, thank
Okay, I see that there are a couple of hands up. I do want to remind everybody, Rocky did not get to give the Sierra Club announcement, so don't disappear yet. Let me share two other questions that came in here in the chat box, and everyone else is welcome to add questions too. One question: Washington, D.C. recently announced a nuclear component to the energy future. Do you have any plans to be a nuclear energy supplier?
No, we do not. And the reason for that is that we're just too small of a company to consider that. Nuclear is extremely expensive. And a company the size of Tampa Electric Company could never invest in something like that. So no, that's not in our future.
Okay.
Plus, that would be really hard to site around here anyways. I mean, if people don't want to live next door to solar, they definitely don't want to live next door to a nuclear plant.
Another question that came in: is a seawall still going to be built around the Big Bend area?
Is your question, is it a seawall around the Big Bend power plant? Is that really the question? I would assume. And yes, there was already a seawall there, and we recently replaced it because it was probably 50 or 60 years old and badly corroded. So we have recently replaced the seawall, at least along the north side of the discharge canal. And I believe there's a future project to replace the seawall on the north side of the plant, but that's just replacing or repairing existing seawall. We are not creating any new seawalls. That's something else that would probably be impossible to permit.
Okay. There's a couple of notes. Thank you very much for all the information you shared. Glad to see you're aware of and trying many new solar technologies such as the agri-PV, floating solar, distributed solar, battery storage, the solar flower, thin film. Thank you for trying creative solutions. So thank you, Stan, for that. Rocky, you have your hand up. Do you have a question for Stan? Please unmute yourself.
I do. I know Tampa Bay's parent company, Emera, is very big in tidal and wind, and they're doing tidal in a lot of places around the world. Does Tampa Bay with our great tides, I know wind wouldn't be very viable, but is Tampa Bay Electric doing anything to consider tidal and wind?
Well, we have looked at wind to an extent. We do have a vertical axis wind turbine at our Clean Energy Demonstration Center. The problem with wind in Florida is it's not very reliable. I mean, it's certainly not like Texas or some of the other states out west. Our best wind in Florida is just off the coast. And of course, that's where all the multi-million-dollar condos are. So someone doesn't want to pay $30 million for a condo and look out at wind turbines. So there's a challenge there, but we are looking into it. And as far as the tide, we haven't looked into that yet, but I'm sure we might in the future. However, even though we do have tides here, it's not like up in Nova Scotia where our parent company is doing some of these projects, because they have really massive tides up there. One of our projects is near the Bay of Fundy, which you know is very famous for its wild fluctuations with the tides that come in and out. But yeah, that's certainly something that we could look at in the future.
Okay, any other questions for Stan?